produced. Well,
Good evening, everyone, for joining us today. I am Sushma Shukla, Associate Professor of Economics at Piedmont, Virginia Community College. I am Chair of the Board of Directors here at the East Coast Colleges Social Science Association, also known as ECCSSA. On behalf of ECCSSA, I am truly delighted to welcome you all to today's colloquium. We have been hosting the colloquium since June of 2020, where we feature talks by significant scholars on a variety of topics. We are attempting to host one colloquium each month, featuring a scholar on some aspects of the wide range of topics. We invite you to join us for future sessions. Now, please allow me to take one moment to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Stanton Green. Dr. Green is a retired professor emeritus and dean of liberal arts at Monmouth University. Currently, he is an adjunct professor at Waterford Institute of Technology, Ireland, and also board of directors at ECCSSA. Dr. Green's research spans 4 decades on cultural change and human ecology in prehistoric and contemporary settings. He is currently focusing on educational systems and the passage of knowledge and values between generations. Dr. Green will talk for about 45 minutes, which will be followed by questions and answers from our participants. Please post your questions in the chat section on of this platform. We also will allow you to unmute your mics and activate your webcams for the purpose of speaking directly. I now yield the floor to Dr. Stanton Green. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Green.
thank you very much, Sushma. Just to make sure, I don't see myself up there. Should I see myself up there? There I am. Okay. I see Bill as well, but that's okay. Hi, everybody. Some of you know me, maybe most of you know me, and I really am pleased to give this webinar, both because it's part of my current doings as a retired professor, and also because of my interest and real passion to try to get ECCSSA on the board, get it the good work it does to as many people as possible. The talk today is higher education is having a nervous breakdown, and within this talk, I'm going to reflect on my last 40 years in higher education and add some additional research. And I'm going to touch on several topics, many of which, maybe all of which, can really be their own talk in themselves, and in fact, are going to be part of my writing projects that I've been working on. Currently, I'm focusing on education and the implications of education with regard to climate change, civil discourse, and student mentoring in preparation of young adults in order for them to move on and be successful in their tackling 21st century and dealing with some of the problems that boomers like me have probably been a large part in causing. But in any case, this is not a guilt thing. It's hopefully very optimistic and a forward-thinking approach. I want to start with a little story, which really sort of got me going and thinking about this. I was a dean for over 20 years, actually, and I hadn't planned to be a dean, but I became a dean. I'm a professor of anthropology and always consider myself first an anthropologist. But I was in front of an auditorium of, I don't know, 400, 500 students and parents, prospective students with their parents. And I was there to basically, they had all been accepted at the university, and I was supposed to be trying to convince them to actually come. These days, as you know, universities are very competitive with each other. In any case, I was making all the cases why they should come to my university. I won't mention it. I actually did it at 2 schools, but I won't mention their names at the moment. And I was talking about the quality. I was talking about the acceptance rate. I was talking about, they could follow their passions and all those things, saying all the right things to the parents. And then all of a sudden, and this didn't really happen to me, but I was reflecting on it, it sort of did. I had one of those moments where a little a little angel jumped on my right shoulder and said, or it said, you ever see those things where you have somebody talking to you on your right and left shoulder? The one on a little devil came up, said, Stan, you just are, you're saying all these things, but are they true? And then another angel jumped on my shoulder and said, well, you're saying all the right things to them. They should be able to know what's going on. But really, maybe you should be telling them that, for example, only 40% of the students in that auditorium, if they came to your university, almost any university, would graduate in 4 years, and only 60% would actually graduate in 6 years, and the other 40% would never graduate from the university. And so maybe you should tell them that, in fact, we have no idea what our graduates do, because no university that I'm aware of actually really keeps track of the graduates and the employment, even though most of them, if you go on their webpages, say 95% employed. And there are a variety of ways they can get around that, but generally speaking, they don't have any, most universities, maybe no universities have the data on that. And then the little devil on my left shoulder, and of course, left is always the evil one, sinistra, in Italian, and gauche in French, says, well, but they know that already. Just tell them to come to your school. Just tell them to come to your school. And I thought about that, and that's what I've been thinking about over the last, maybe 10 years, especially, although as a dean, I was thinking about almost all the time. I was thinking about graduation rates. I was thinking about college debt. And I was thinking about, for example, I was just listening to a podcast, several universities, the ones many of us know, Harvard, Yale, MIT, Bryn Mawr, all those schools are being sued for collusion for price fixing, because all of them cost the same amount of money. And how does that happen? How does that happen? They're all $50,000 and $60,000. How does that happen? So anyway, there's all these suits about this. And then the other thing I was thinking about was, of course, working with a lot of students, which is what I really like to do now, is they really have a tough way of it in terms of going out into the job market. Just getting personal just for a second, I had 3 kids, 3 millennials, and they all have, they started hitting the job market in 2009. And anybody knows about at least the American job scene, 2009 was the worst in decades in terms of getting a job. So I decided to think more systematically about that. So the talk is focusing on what I call, and I use it metaphorically because really institutions can't have nervous breakdowns, but I think it's equivalent to a nervous breakdown an individual would have, because universities, and I've been inside them for over 4 decades now, really have they do not know how to cope with the external factors and the external challenges. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's not all going to be a downer talk, because I'm going to talk about some cool things that are happening. And I think I have people on now who are participating who actually are part of some of those cool things. So having said that, let me go on to my what is the big idea? Why is this such a big idea? Why this is sort of a TED Talk question. What is the big idea in this talk? Well, you can see it in front of you. Higher education is basically out of sync with how culture is changing, contemporary culture. And it's not doing a very good job of synchronizing with it. Whoops. And this is especially important because it's, in my mind, is undermining America's future. We can probably, many of you can think about the fact that, in fact, with regard to student debt, the amazing burden we're putting on students as they graduate, but also the skills gap, and the fact that people keep talking about all these thousands of jobs that are out there, and there are all these thousands of unemployed students or underemployed students. So to my mind, higher education is a big problem for our society. I would put it even, I've heard it put even more starkly than this. Dr. Scott Galloway, who's a pretty well-known businessman, speaker, professor at NYU, says that higher education is the greatest threat to greatest threat to the American middle class in 50 years, has been the greatest threat to the American middle class in 50 years. And if you think about that, that's exactly opposite of what most people think, because most people think that going to college is the way to get into the middle class. So in order to think about this, I turn on my anthropology hat. Education to me, or to an anthropologist, is two things, has two functions. It basically serves to transmit knowledge and values between generations. And in a broader sense, it is basically the rite of passage from childhood to adulthood. Now, being a Jewish kid from Brooklyn, I got bar mitzvahed, but that was not really a rite of passage, even though maybe in biblical terms at times it was. But we really, as a society, do not have a formal way of basically moving from childhood to adulthood. And higher education, going to college, has taken on that role. For better or worse, it's taken on that role. And so it's during that time when you have to deal with traditional values, new values, old knowledge, new knowledge. And those of you who know me, I always use baseball analogies. Joe Doranson, who's on a participant, is the reason for this. The new manager of the Mets, he's a pretty smart guy. And he said, we have to recognize recognizing the need to change does not mean that one disrespects tradition. But then again, what was going on in the past isn't necessarily exactly what we need to survive in the future. So some of the symptoms of this educational nervous breakdown are some of the many symptoms, but maybe some of the core ones. Speak to three existential global threats. One is the inability to cope with the information explosion, the inability to understand climate change, and the inability to create models of economic sustainability. And when I think about where the 21st century needs to go, and maybe the next 25 years needs to go, we don't start gaining control of these issues, Western civilization, society as we know it, is going to change, and maybe not for the better. Some examples: inability to cope with information explosion. We have very few people, and a special one that I picked out here, Mr. Zuckerberg, who basically has no moral compass. And because of that, he has opened up this information explosion into what he now calls the metaverse. Other people have called it that. But for example, the issue of informational literacy is not really taught at higher education, even though it's maybe touched on a bit. But the one issue that I thought was really pretty interesting that's out there all the time is the issue of individual freedom versus community safety. Zuckerberg, and we all know the issue of Facebook with regard to politics, disinformation, with regard to American elections, with regard to COVID. And we have a couple international people who are seeing it probably showing up in different ways in their places. So the inability to cope with information, the information explosion has amazing societal and political implications. Whoops. Oh, I went two here. Then there's the inability to understand climate change. Now, my inability to use technology too well has unfortunately made it so I could not embed a video here. But some of you may be familiar with this Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who a couple of years ago he brought a snowball into Congress to show that climate was not getting warmer because there was snow in Washington, D.C. Okay, we have leaders who actually believe this stuff, and worse than that, they purport it. So the inability to deal with climate change is one of the issues with regard to, it's one of the issues that higher education does not do a great job of. And finally, the inability to create economic sustainability. Here I would point to, the issues right now of climate change and shifting over to renewable energies. I myself find it so frustrating that American politicians, for the most part, do not understand that the green economy is a win-win situation. And even if they want to be greedy, and I will put an editorial comment in here, and people can, I know it's a little political and partisan, but that's what it is. Senator Manchin owns stock in coal companies, right? He could get much richer if he owned stock in green economic companies. I'd be willing, and I'm saying this, not completely unseriously, I'd be willing to say, Senator Manchin, extort as much as you can from Joe Biden to make West Virginia the greatest green economy on the planet. You become a local hero. But economic sustainability is not understood and not taught very much in universities. When I taught a course in climate change, and the students I really enjoyed having, because they led to the most conversation, were the business students, because their answer to everything about it, everything ecological, was we can't afford it. And I was able to, not because my own research, because there's hundreds and thousands of scientists and economists who've done this for us, show them that in fact, not only is it economically possible, but it's the economic choice for prosperity. And coal mining is not the economic choice for prosperity. But if higher education doesn't play its role, that message doesn't get out there. Whoops, pressed the wrong button, there we go. Universities, for the most part, have dealt with these issues very superficially and very, in many ways, selfishly. The typical university response that I've been a part of, and I've been part of deans associations, and I was a provost for a while, so I know I have personal experience, but I also have broad experience, is they focus on themselves. So their response to all this, this kind of nervous breakdown of how do we deal with all these problems is to worry about themselves. And so they try to basically raise as much money as they can. They answer all questions by trying to grow, but this really favors the super elitists. So I don't know, I think you can see those charts there, but the growth of the endowment at Harvard is obscene, really quite obscene. And they get millions, hundreds of millions a year. Their endowment, I think, is about $60 billion. Not 60 million, 60 billion. The interest that they get off their endowment could fund some state systems, I would say. But if you would talk to them, they would still ask for more donations. And of course, it's very prestigious to give to Harvard. The other thing that universities are doing, which is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but is not really the real response, is they're merging. And this is inevitable. And I've seen this coming for 20 years. At all the schools I've been a dean at, I've seen this coming. And in fact, so like I was at Clarion University for 10 years as the dean. That is now merged with 3 other universities. My son went to Marlborough College. That is now merged with Emerson College. In order to stay economically afloat, schools have had to merge. Not necessarily a bad thing, but that doesn't solve the problem, because the problem is education, not financial survival. If you're just going to merge and do the same stuff so you can survive it economically, that doesn't prepare students any better than if you were separate universities. All it does is allow you to exist. A lot of inside baseball. I saw this article, I had to put it in there. The Washington Post says that now people are, the big issue in math departments is should they teach geometry before algebra? I use that as an example, not because maybe, I don't know, maybe mathematicians really think that's important, but the point is that's so in the weeds compared to what we should be worrying about with our students. Geometry before algebra? I might argue, I've always said I don't really understand why the sequence of math is the same for everybody, and why students who are going to become artists need to take 4 years of mathematics through algebra 2 and geometry 3 and whatever. But the point is, universities are either superficially approaching these issues or they're in the weeds. And the question then comes down to, is higher ed a liberal bastion, as some people call it, or a conservative cloister, which is what I would call it. And all of this, all the things that speak to me with some of the examples I gave, indicate basically higher ed is very conservative. Higher ed response to its nervous breakdown is the same as it was post-World War II. Higher ed structure had the growth in higher education was tied to the coattails of the World War II economic boom. And basically higher ed reproduces the status quo. and become increasingly irrelevant to all but the most affluent Americans, quite honestly. It really does not tie the student needs, the societal needs to those 4 years, which is a significant time period in preparing students to solve some of these existential problems. So that I put out as a maybe provocative, maybe all this is provocative, that provocative answer, proposal that most people would really at first face value would disagree with. I believe higher ed is one of the most conservative institutions we have in at least in the United States. So to be a public good, education has to engage students. That's the really, now I'm trying to move on to a positive flow. So what do we really do? We need to engage students in creating a sustainable future. That's what they want. That's what we can give them. And that's the role of, that's the kind of thing that education needs to be transmitting. And to that, I turn to the matriarch of anthropology. Okay, I'm looking at Margaret Mead. You're all looking at Margaret Mead. This is an old slogan she said. I don't know that she invented it, and it's very cliche in a sense, but I'm going to drill a little deeper into it. Children must be taught how to think, not what to think. Things we need to do. We need to learn about culture change. We have to face, education has to yield to the realities of culture change. Things are changing. Basic assumptions that anthropologists make. Culture change is inevitable. Culture change has been accelerating. And the very nature of how cultures are changing is changing. That's the hard part. I think most people would agree with the first two. But what Mead points out in her wonderful book, Culture and Commitment, which she wrote 50 years ago, she wrote this because of the 1960s generation gap, which was a mild version of what we're seeing today in terms of generation gaps. The very nature of how cultures are changing is changing. Now, I don't want to get into deep culture change theory here. I'm not interested in doing that anymore. I used to do it. I used to teach it, but we're going to look at it in a pretty simple way. If you look at the history of culture change, this is really Mead's model. Pre-industrial culture change, before 1850 or whatever, maybe before 1800, learning to be your grandparents was the way to become a successful adult. Just think about these as I talk about them. In industrial culture, learning to be your parents was a way to become a successful adult. In postmodern culture, we're dealing with cultural pioneers. People are moving in, students are moving in, young adults are moving into a future which is unknowable. I'll use just a couple of examples before I move on a little bit here. Learning to be cultural pioneers. When I was started at a university, which was 50 years ago, websites, web pages, the internet didn't exist. But these days, what university doesn't have a department of 25 people, at least in IT and website design and maintaining websites and graphic design and all those things? Those things were not something I was educated in because it wasn't an area that even existed. But I'll give you even a more personal take on this. Learning to be my grandfather. My grandfather moved in 1917 to the Lower East Side in New York. He worked at the Essex Market. He also peddled things on the street. And in the early 1900s, that's where he came. He came from Poland. My grandmother came from Hungary. And that's the world they moved into. It's historic, it's heritage, it's important. There were certain values built into it that need to be passed on. But learning to be my grandfather, who was also used to fish on Coney Island, what they call it, surf fish for shad, that wasn't really going to be quite make me a successful adult when I was growing up. But learning to be my father. My father is the man in the middle there. He's got the plaid shirt on. Anybody, I don't know if anybody knows what those machines are. Some of you might know, but he was a linotype operator at the New York Times. New York Times ran this story as part of an article because there were exactly 4 linotype machines left in the United States, according to this interesting documentary that was made called Linotype. And they're all in a museum in Massachusetts somewhere. But he was what they call a printer. He was a member of the Printers Union, and he learned a linotype machine, and that was his life. He did that for 25 years. Learning to be my father as a linotype operator wasn't going to do it for me. This doesn't mean that certain values, certain traditions, certain knowledge shouldn't be passed on, but preparing me for become a successful adult when I was a college student, that aspect was not, learning to be a linotype printer was not going to work for me. I would just mention as a footnote, his last 3 to 5 years at the times he actually was transitioning to computers. That's when the New York Times in the, I guess it was in the late 70s, early 80s, moved from linotype to computer. It's not that long ago. For some of us, it's not long ago at all. So he was actually being re-educated into the computer world. So there was some smart people there, at least at the Times and other newspapers that were doing that. But essentially learning to be my father. That is what it used to be like. I remember having conversations with my parents. I remember getting even more personal, but I used to try to explain to them that they kept, as most parents do, and I do it as well, but they kept worrying about, you know, was I successful? Was I happy? Did I really want to be doing what I was doing? Because I wasn't doing what they did. And I realized at one point that living their life and dealing with retirement in their way, moving from New York to Florida, was their key to success. And they wanted that for their children, but all of our, you know, that was not our key to success. We were living in a different world. And it was an interesting conversation. So that tension between generations is so important. And that tension is cultural. Future jobs. I'm listing these. I'm not going to read them off for you, but you can look at them while I talk for a couple of minutes. I don't really know what's going to be in the future. Certainly automation is big. AI is big. And there are all kinds of things that robots are big, things that we can be building into college curricula that go along with a good liberal arts education. And I hope it comes out eventually. I will talk about this. I'm not talking about leaving the liberal arts behind. I'm talking about transforming the liberal arts. Underneath most of this is writing. I often say when I see a good movie, read a good book, or hear a good speaker, or see a good technological presentation, it's all in the writing. It's all in the writing. But these are some of the skills and some issues that are being dealt with by that our children, our students, young adults are trying to deal with. And most of them are not things that we've dealt with. The bottom one there, work from home, is quite a recent one, right? So the other thing that the other take on culture change and how cultures are changing was written about by Robert Bly, who was a poet laureate of the United States, of American poet laureate, and wrote, I don't know, 30 books or whatever. He wrote a book called Sibling Society. And what he basically was talking about is that and he was writing that book, I think it might've been in the 90s, but it might've been a little later. I don't know what the date on that is. It might be a little earlier, but he was saying that we were moving into what he called the Sibling Society. What I was sort of calling, or Mead might be calling, a postmodern society, where a lot of learning occurs at the peer level. And that's really important. And you can see that among students. Now, it certainly happened with me as a student, but it happens much more with them because students can relate to the experiences and needs and challenges and successes of their peers. And in many ways, in better ways than people that the professors and teachers and parents. There needs to be a combination of that. So peer, and there's other sociologists who use different terms for this, but the sibling society is something that basically bonds generations, has information flow going horizontally, not necessarily vertically. So what do we have to do? Let's talk a little practical, and then I'll see if people have, hopefully people will have some questions, conversations, reactions, disagreements. I'm going to throw out a few. To me, they're not provocative, but I know they're provocative in the big world. First of all, we have to understand that the American education system was built, it's based on an 18th century developmental cycle, biological developmental cycle. And Leon Botstein, who was the president of Bard College and a symphony director, who's been the president, he was the president of Bard College when he was 28, and he still is. He must be president for over 30 years, maybe more. Wrote a great book called Jefferson's Children, where he talks about the fact that we need to change the way we deal with students and how, in fact, we define children and adults and how we apply that to high school and college. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We need to understand intelligence as multifaceted. Here I turn to Howard Gardner, who's written many books. His first book was called Frames of Mind, where he lays out his theory of multiple intelligences. And as one of the more recent ones is on the app generation. And he talks about the role of apps in terms of problem solving and how people who use apps actually thinking differently than people that don't use apps, and how that's changed the way people solve problems. I have to say just one thing about Gardner. He's much more than just an educator out of the School of Education, even though that's where I think he's still teaching there. But his project is biologically and based in brain science, and the research, which the institute, which he calls Project Zero, has a track record of 30, 40 years of understanding the various intelligences, and he has 8 of them that he sets up, that we have to understand intelligence in that way. Then we have to acknowledge and integrate the enormous pool of available virtual resources. To this, I turn just as an example of Anya Kamenetz, who's an educator, speaker. She's on NPR a lot. She writes for the New York Times. She's a writer. One of her first books was called DIY Do-It-Yourself University. This was written, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. It was actually given to me by my son, who said, you need to look at this. And she points out all the resources for learning. Sitting in the classroom is not the only way people learn, and it is not the only people will learn, whether or not colleges ever realize this or not. And some of this can be integrated into classroom learning, some of it's very independent. But there's an enormous pool of available virtual resources out there for learning, and some corporations use them actually as part of their training. So here's a proposal. This comes from Botstein. According to Botstein, we need to reinvent the high school college connection. I don't know if the picture is blocking it from you, but there it is. Okay. Bard College has a school called Bard Simon's Rock, and a friend and colleague of ours, John Justison, who couldn't make it tonight, he sent his son there. Actually, it's based upon a rethinking of high school, where instead of K through 12, it's K through 10. And after grade 10, which would be, most people call it the sophomore year, students would be basically given several different opportunities to further their education. Community college, internships, apprenticeships, entry-level jobs, or go directly to a BA program, or stay in high school. I don't have that on there, but that's the status quo. We all know ourselves and other people who are, the last 2 years, high school was great for them, but we also know a lot of people who high school was sort of a waste of time. And the way I like to put it is, you've got a 17 or an 18-year-old boy or girl, young man or young woman, and you're making them sit in chairs and passively learn for the most part. Maybe they do some lab work. But you're basically teaching them as a child, as a passive learner, and in the same way they've been taught the previous 10 years, or 11 years, or 12 years. There needs to be some rethinking of that. There are programs, I've worked on several. There was always great resistance. I don't know if it's getting any better. For example, there are high schools that allow students to take college credits to fulfill their high school accreditation simultaneously. That occurs. but there is a lot of resistance to that. The status quo, like I said, education is very conservative. Anyway, reinventing the high school. Transforming the BA from Carnegie to Boyer. I'm just going to, this is sort of a teaser for Dr. Ibar's talk, which he's going to do next month on the academic renaissance. But we need to create realistic four-year BA degrees. First of all, a four-year degree doesn't really exist because most students take more than that if they graduate at all. So what we have here is either a grift or a flaw. You can decide on the motivation of it. But quite honestly, higher education and students are not getting a good deal. We need to create master's degrees that are professional degrees. And I've been involved with, in fact, created two, for example, professional degrees in archaeology, where students come out with a master's degree with a broad breadth of anthropology and archaeology, classroom learning, book learning, research, but also the skills to actually do archaeology. There are a lot of fields for master's level archaeologists, not a lot of programs. We have to align the AA, the BA, and the MA. We have to rejuvenate the community college. And the last thing I will say is we have to assess the Carnegie unit. The Carnegie unit is the credit, the way credits are given out. This was done by Andrew Carnegie 100 years ago, I think. And I'm not going to say it myself, even though I fully believe it. Ernest Boyer, who was the chancellor of the SUNY system when I was a student, he wrote in 1993, which is 30 years ago almost, I'm convinced the time has come to bury once and for all the old Carnegie unit, transformed into English, the 3-credit course. I won't say any more about that, but I think we might have a good conversation about that next month. We have to reinvent the curriculum. We have to move from content-based to knowledge-based. We have to build knowledge, and we have knowledge and skilled courses. We don't want to leave content behind, but we want to teach content via skills and knowledge. We need to attach pertinent literacies to all courses and programs. And I list 4 that I believe, and there are probably more, and many of you can think of them, I'm sure. And environmental literacy, and I know Monmouth University, where I was most recently, is doing a lot of work with that. And there are coalitions of faculty who are doing that. Personal financial literacy, that is not done nearly as much, and it's not just a business school that should be teaching that. World languages, come on now, we need to really, we want Americans to play a role in the 21st century. That's a no-brainer. And we need to do career mentoring, because moving from school to work doesn't happen like instantaneously without any mentoring. Those are just 4. We need to energize the pedagogical choices. We have the traditional ones, teach as you were taught. The didactic one, I spelled that correct. Pass me the knowledge, basically. And this is why college professors, such as myself and everybody else, we have several on board here, get frustrated with our students, even though I think a good teacher never blames a student, in general. But basically, they're taught in a passive way. What do I need to know? What do I need to know? And some people go as far, and I have colleagues from Harvard who say this, and I like to always say, you can always tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much or her much. The marination model. I've had a colleague tell me that you can absorb a good education just by going to Harvard. I don't believe education is absorbable. It's not an issue of just membrane absorption. We need to move to experiential and activist pedagogy. I know I'm going quickly, but hopefully we're going to have more conversation on this. We need to take advantage of the time and space continuum and get out of the classroom. That's all I'll say. We have learned a lot about that under the challenge of COVID, and it is not easy. And I'm not suggesting any of this can be done without educational support and developmental support for professors and teachers. But for my last year of teaching, my last semester of teaching actually, was stopped dead on March 9th 2020, and many of you may remember, that's the day that schools closed. That's the day that COVID shut down American society. Bam, that was the beginning of spring break. We came back remote, had 1 week to make that adjustment. Obviously, that's not the way to do it, but it should have opened some eyes. We have to expand learning environments. Another way of saying this, we got to get students out there. I've got some examples here, pictures on the left, marine science classes, tutorials. On the right, of course, I had to put something about an archaeological excavation. I taught for, like I said, I've been in education for over 40 years. Even when I was a dean, I would teach and I would do archaeological field schools. To me, I was best at teaching students, and students were best at learning by doing archaeology. And that was the most fulfilling of educational experiences for me, and I think many of my students. So I'm going to close with just a few examples because I don't want this to be I've made it into sort of, here's the problem, here's all the amazing things we have to do, which seem nearly impossible. But I want to close with things that are being done. And I know some of you in the audience are doing these things. Studio programs. I put up one that speaks to one I was involved with, and I started with a professor who's in the lower left there, who's working in the studio. He teaches in the music industry program. He teaches music students how to move into the music industry, but basically setting up some of his courses basically as boardrooms. They become a music label. And in fact, they put out 15 CDs over the last one a year, the last 15 years, have become part of the Grammy Museum affiliates. And I have to throw a picture of Bruce Springsteen on there because they now are involved with the Springsteen Archives and Springsteen Music for Center, Center for American Music. These students are music students. Some of them play instruments, many of them sing. Some of them are just basically on the business side. And I'm proud to say my son is that, although he plays instruments as well. The music industry, not to put too much of a point on this, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yes, it's changing and people don't buy albums so much anymore, but that's because music is being offered in many different ways, and many people and people are needed in all different kinds of ways for that. So in any case, studio programs. Music is one that can be done. GIS studio courses. I was happened to be a part of the University of South Carolina when they started their first GIS program. Now they have one of the best PhD GIS programs in the world. And one of the things that GIS studies do is they actually take on real world clients. So a student doesn't just go to a GIS lab. And I mean, they do have some of those classes where you learn the fundamentals, but eventually you deal with problems in geographic information system, enacting problems. For example, school busing is a big program. How does a business locate itself is a big GIS problem. And they take on a client, and that course, that class will actually take on the client and deal with a business plan, a GIS plan during the course of that semester, or in some cases, full year. So they're learning content, they're learning skills and knowledge, and they're learning content through the actual doing and the actual real world experience. Come on now. Learn a curriculum made up of internships. You know, I could say that and maybe some people wouldn't believe it, but Joe Dornson, I think, knows about the city of school in New York. Maybe others of you do. That's a high school that's built entirely on internships. They basically build a curriculum in science and liberal arts and whatever, and students basically learn by using New York City as their campus. And I was there once for a conference and I participated in it. It's pretty amazing. Not all students like to do it that way, but I can tell you a lot of students who don't like the traditional way do really well with that. So the City S School has been an ongoing, I don't know how long, but many, many years, has been an ongoing public high school in New York City. And their curriculum is based on internships. It's not to say they don't have any content courses. They have they focus a lot on writing, but like I said, it's all in the writing, but their learning is primarily through doing. So these are things that are being done. And this is the one I'm going to end on because I find it the most amazing. My wife and I found this movie because, you know, there were 140 new Christmas movies put out this year. This one was called Santa Girl. And we decided to watch it because we just needed something to get our minds off of everything else. And as it turned out, we had no idea. This movie was shot on Shenandoah University, and the university was the film set, and it was the location. And except for a couple of the lead roles, the students did everything in making that movie. They had other people there. They had producers and things like that, but they played all the roles, much like they do in the music industry program. So if you go to Shenandoah University, you will see something about how these students, and I think they were out of theater and communication mostly, but any student could be a participant in this, actually learned and met their requirements in the arts and learned how to move into the arts should they want to by actually making a movie. And since then, I found one or two other movies. So this is happening. I had no idea. It's not a bad movie, actually. But when you look at it, and when I was watching it, when I figured out it was students in the movie, I really enjoyed it. Because some of you know I'm a big fan of college theater, and nothing that makes you more proud than seeing a really good college production by students, because they just grow so much by doing that. So the campus as a classroom. These things are happening in many more places than I know. Those are my recommendations. I hope that some of you disagree with them. Some of them are quite provocative. I'm going to close with those and open it up to questions. Sushma, are you still there? I thank you for your attention. And we have, it's good. I went almost about 45 minutes. We have a half an hour if we want it to talk about some of these things. So I think you may be allowed, or you're allowed to unmute, or do we have to unmute you? Let's see.
I think we can pop off mute.
You can?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. All right. Hey, Bob, nice to see you up there. So I'm going to open the floor and see if anybody has any questions. Sushma, did any come in on the participant on the chat? I see a couple.
First, can you please stop sharing this PowerPoint? So that will be good.
Can I see what now?
Can you stop sharing your PowerPoint first?
Stop sharing it? Oh, I
Yes.
see.
Yeah.
I should be able to, let's see now. If this is the, stop sharing it. I want to stop it. How do I do that? How do I stop sharing it?
It's a button there. Say stop. It's a button there, right side.
Oh, I got it. Okay. There we go. There we go.
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
All right. So
Excellent.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Green. This was such a rich and meaningful dialogue. And I'm going to watch that movie that you have shared. And also the book you mentioned, DIVU. So definitely you have shared some, as an instructor, I think I have gained some very nice resources that I'm going to use. So now, if it's time for questions and answers, either you can mute yourself or you can write your questions in that section so we can discuss.
I know some of you can know more about this than I do, so, and I'll prod a couple if you need me to, but.
I'll jump in, I guess, from Australia here, sitting outside, just to share a little personal story about myself. I think it's a obviously really important subject to address. I'm quite critical of America because I love it so much, but I do worry that the country is falling behind in many ways. And I'm a American expat living in Australia now, and we moved here purely because quality of life offered here is far superior these days. The American dream is kind of crumbling, I think, unfortunately. We live in a country now that has universal health care, and should we choose to raise a family, affordable higher education that doesn't put you in debt for most of your life. I'm 36 and just paid off my student loans last week, finally, because I have given up on Joe Biden stepping in for any kind of student debt relief for us. So yeah, I mean, I think if these things aren't addressed at the higher level, people are going to try to address them themselves and teach themselves new, however they see fit, if they're not going to be able to get what needs to be offered from universities. And I think you see that in politics throughout constantly with, Congress not addressing gun laws and kids of these attending schools that have had school shootings, starting massive movements around the country. You can see it all over the place. Same with climate change that you touched on. But yeah, very important subject. And yeah, I think a little rambly, but just wanted to jump in there.
This is Bill Proudfoot. I'm in Hong Kong. I'm not really an academic. I occasionally teach a graduate level class at Hong Kong University for the library program there. But one of my questions to you, Stan, is that you mentioned that higher education was not synchronized with contemporary culture. But do you really want higher education to be so tightly synced with contemporary culture? There's an advantage in keeping higher education separated from the zeitgeist of right now, so that people can have some perspective on it. You don't want to just be, sort of slavishly following what contemporary culture is interested in at the moment, because it changes all the time.
I can answer that, but someone else wants to answer it. Anybody else have an opinion on that?
I'll go there.
Okay.
The question that you're asking is really a philosophical question that we have never been able to answer. And that is the entire idea of art for art's sake. And the concept that is a purist concept that addresses exactly this issue. But we have lost the focus of even that philosophical concept in our current status of academe today. So we cannot even say that we are even mirroring the zeitgeist of the current society, much less one that is in the process of formation. So I would argue that we're as a nation, we have not put education as a priority. We only address the issues of education when there is an external threat to our nation, as it was when Sputnik went up into the air in '57, and then all of a sudden, right after that, we started with all of these international programs to teach Russian and international studies at the universities, and there's been one case after the other. Right now, we have a threat from China and Russia, and we're as underprepared now as we were at the time of Sputnik. In fact, even worse. because it's also an IT threat that we're also facing, and we're unprepared at all three levels. So I would just argue that we need to, there's a place for art's sake in terms of maintaining some departments that are capable of teaching Russian Pravoslavna, in other words, the old Russian language, as well as the current Russian language, both in the same department, so that we can move forward with our intelligence operations in that area.
I'll just throw a couple of quick responses to or thoughts about that. First, I think it's a false choice between the notion of arts for art's sake and preparing for life and preparing for careers. And I'm not sure what you were implying there, Bill. I think I understand what you're saying, but my point is that that's a false choice. I think what we have to recognize is that change is changing. And so we can no longer assume, we cannot critically accept knowledge from any direction. I mean, and I know critical thinking, it's one of my pet peeves because I don't know how many people, it's hard to get your head around that, as they say. But the point is, you have to put the succeeding generations in a position of dealing with not as Bobby, I was going to say Bobby Valentine. God, I'm getting old, aren't I? As Buck Showalter said, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You have to respect tradition, but you also have to understand that change is occurring. And that balance, that tension, somehow, this is what I would argue, Bill, directly to what you were saying, that tension has to be recognized. I'm not saying give students everything they want. I never argued that. I always told, and when I met with parents many times and students were complaining, I'd say, I can't give you what you want. I'm here to give you what you need. At the same time, giving them what they need has to take into account what they want, what their perspective and what they need is. Asking a class, and I've done this, maybe some of you have, Joe, Bill, David, you're down there, all the professors. Asking a class, what do you want to learn about? When I taught climate change, what do you want to learn about climate change? They're so passive, they haven't really been taught to do that, but you got to start somewhere. So we have to give them what they need, but giving them what they need has to be taken into account what they want and what they perceive they need. Because I've given a talk, and this is among ones I'm developing, on how millennials see a completely different world than we do. I mean, I love the two people I like to connect as two of my heroes is Greta Thunberg and Jane Goodall. Greta just turned 18 or 19, and Jane is, I don't know, approaching 90, I think. But they're both two great humanitarians, and they both deal with the human condition from very, very different perspectives, of course. But you have to deal with both perspectives. So yes, we don't want to bury ourselves in, and say, well, if we say we're going to be able to cope with the present world, we won't be, the future is going to be different. But we have to cope with the fact that things are change is inevitable. It's getting faster, and it's changing the way it changes. And that's why I think at the bottom line, there's this false choice in terms of higher education. Higher education is not an issue of narration, in my perspective. It's not an issue of learning the liberal arts for liberal arts' sake. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being an English major.
Nope.
Right? But when I mentor students, I always say, you want to be an English major? That's great. Minor in Spanish, minor in business, minor in something that will give you, that can mesh because no matter what, you're moving into the real world. I'm yield to Bill Schreiber because he has his hand up. He's so polite.
Wow, Bill. Yeah, hi there. I can't resist myself on occasions like this. It's good to hear from you, Stan. It's been a while.
Yes.
And but this is quite interesting. I'm struck by the fact that, yeah, there's things changing like crazy all around us, but individuals mostly resist change. They find it threatening, difficult to accept. And the other thing is we only know certain ways of doing things. typically run a classroom the way I was in classes in the 60s, but I fight my way out of that as much as I possibly can. That's why I like teaching in laboratories, which is the closest thing, you know, kind of early chemical education comes to field work.
Bill's a
But this,
chemist, by the way. You
yeah.
should mention that. You're a chemist, right?
I'm a chemist, indeed. So for a long time now. But the real issue is that people feel threatened by change. So and you know, we're seeing that in the politics that are existing now that are heartbreaking in so many ways. And somehow that's, I think there's quite a thing to figure out as to how to make it. Doesn't scare me much at this age part of my life, but it certainly is frightening to a lot of people. A lot of people see it as losing power. We certainly see that going on. And just familiarity is something that we like to have. So, you know, I don't know have any answers, but I think that's one of the basic problems that I hope can be addressed by some appropriate group, psychology or whatever. And of course, the other thing going on that you didn't mention was the thing that's killing us is the fact that every one of us here, maybe not every one of us, but people all over have different realities because of what comes to them all the time, because of these evil little things that we carry around. Anyway, I just appreciating this and enjoying the conversation, and thank you all.
Thanks, Bill. David Whiteman had his hand up, and then Joe, and then Bob, and then Joe. If I can get this right. David, you want to talk?
Yeah. Hi, Stan.
Yeah.
It's good to see you online. Since we don't see each other in person, even in Columbia. So one thing I was thinking about as you were talking that I've always found interesting is there's a program here at USC in the music school for musical. I think maybe they might even be required, but it's for musical entrepreneurship. And the idea is that, you know, these are all musicians who are learning what musicians learn, but they also then learn entrepreneurship. And it seemed like a really innovative way to make sure that, you know, you're not a musician with no skills to get a job. You know, you have all these entrepreneurial skills. I have a daughter who is an English major, and that's sometimes what I wish she had, you know, had some courses on English entrepreneurship so that she could have been a entrepreneur as well. And I think back on some of my classes I used to teach, like environmental politics, and I think, you know, part of my goal there was to make them all entrepreneurs in the environmental space where, you know, they could do things on their own and have creativity and initiative and those kinds of skills. So entrepreneurship is not a word that I've, you know, normally embraced since it seems pretty status quo, but you know, I really do like that idea of the music and, you know, liberal arts entrepreneurship, I guess.
Right. Well, just since David and I go way back, but David's an entrepreneur in a sense. He's a political science professor, but an entrepreneur in the local film presentation world, involved in a local theater, so which is very important. I consider that entrepreneurial. Joe Niven up in my top left corner, but you had your hand up, Joe?
Yes. Do I have to unmute myself? I will.
Good. I can hear you, Joe. This is the different Joe. Joe
Fine.
Jordan. Yeah, we can hear you.
Joe D.
Joe D, you're on. We'll go to Joe N next. Go on, Joe.
Joe, now you unmuted, you muted yourself, so please
Unmute.
Yes. No. It's still muted.
So how's that?
Good, good.
I'm good? Okay. It's, all right. Well, it's Moshe Kapaya, as we say in Yiddish. I want to commend you, first of all, because I wish I had your cosmic optimism, Stan. And I sense disconnects in your presentation that impact on me. As a radical in politics, I'm a conservative in education. It sounds crazy, but it's part of my DNA. I feel that we are facing an existential threat to democracy, and largely due to what Richard Hofstadter, my mentor at Columbia, pointed out is a divisive strain in American culture, anti-intellectualism, which has found its pernicious way into all of our educational systems. This attack on critical race theory is one example, and the use by politicians of the far right to gain the governorship of Virginia. The fact that we had an ignoramus, a vulgarian in the White House for 4 years is an example of our failure to educate properly our youth. So let me go through a historical framework, if I may. I remember reading Bernard Bailyn on education, and in the formative years of America, education came through three sources: religion, family, and community. And in every one of these institutions, there's been a contemporary breakdown. Families are fragmented, communities are blue and red politically, and no longer speak the same language. So I'm deeply troubled by the effort to change to a almost John Dewey-like learn by doing. I think the intellect needs to be honored, and traditional values and literacy, which was so strikingly and conspicuously absent from the last students I taught at Long Island University, was deeply troubling. And part of it has been the culture of passing students, especially minority students, because they were well-behaved without injecting the necessary literacy. Also, there was an attempt to democratize education. And we forgot the vocational education is equally potent. And I think there is something to be said for the English system, the several tier system. If you can't cut the mustard, to use a crude expression, funnel students into vocational enterprises, and they could earn a lot. A plumber makes a lot more money than a teacher. One last thing, and I hope I'm not monopolizing this discourse. I went to Stuyvesant High School. I was the worst science student there, I must confess. But I came back as an alumnus, and I listened to the contemporary graduates or recent graduates. When we were at Stuyvesant and later at Columbia, we wanted to be doctors, lawyers, and teachers, academics. I was listening to these students, mostly Asian. Those are the new Jews in Stuyvesant anyway. And they were talking, I went to Columbia, I went to Harvard, and then I went to business school. And so this emphasis on entrepreneurship is deeply disturbing to me, because I come from a Marxist family, and somehow I was brainwashed that business was somewhat unkosher. And today we see this disparity in income. We're growing more and more disparate in our income. And I don't see anything in our educational system that addresses it. So we could learn by doing, we could have environmental classes, but unless we go back to civil discourse among and between students and faculty, and we reduce violence. I mean, New York City is like the Wild West now. Recently, an Asian woman was thrust off a platform and killed by a homeless person. And so there are a lot of things we have to do socially as well as educationally. So I admire your optimism, but I still think there's something to be said for traditional values, community, family, and even religion. And I'm saying this as an atheist, but I realize the values of those formerly powerful institutions.
Thank you, Joe. I'll just go around and when people make comments, you can follow up on Joe, or maybe you had a different one, different perspective, but Joanne, the other Joe is up now.
Yeah, I think Joe's problem is that he went to Stuyvesant. I went to Brooklyn Tech before going to Columbia College. And I wanted to relate a story from David Sidorsky, who I had for several classes in philosophy. And one time I was in his office and he said, you know, perhaps I shouldn't have gone into philosophy and I should have stayed working in my parents' grocery store in Brooklyn. I would have enjoyed my life better. I think the way I approach it is again, this, what are we doing with this life that we have here? And when I teach my students in anthropology, even though it's an introductory class, what I have them each do is original research. Clearly, it's very elementary, but they learn about hypothesis testing. They have to come up with a hypothesis. They have to go out in the real world and observe people. Then they have to interview them. And then they have to integrate the information. So the whole question for me is, how do you make knowledge? Because this textbook that we have did not fall out of the sky. It was made by other anthropologists. And so I've always taken that kind of approach in terms of the learning by doing is how do we make knowledge? And I've used that same approach when I taught law. I was a lawyer as well. I taught lawyering skills. I've also been a digital artist and taught how to manipulate images. So it's always a question whether the field I'm in is, well, how do we use this tool set that we have to make it work for us? And so in that sense, I respond, positively to, that what your premises of the talk are, is that's how do we reintegrate this kind of making knowledge work for us in this new environment.
And now, Bob, you're up next. Bob Petrulis.
Sure. Hi.
Thank you, Joe.
Sorry, I came in late. I thought you were starting at 7:30, not at 7. So anyway, that doesn't matter.
You started at 7:15. You missed a little bit, but not too much. Okay.
You were just reminding me of when I was teaching undergraduates at a little liberal arts college in the middle of the wilds of central Michigan. And because I was on the faculty, I had a certain number of students that I had to advise every semester. And I often started my advising appointments by asking the students what they wanted to learn next. What's your learning project? I would ask them. And they would typically give me a list of the courses they thought they were required to take. Maybe an elective or two that they might be able to squeeze in there. And I would really try to get them to think, well, what is it that you want to learn? What's your project? What are you trying to get out of being here? And it was really clear that for many of them, it was a piece of paper. It was the degree. It was their ticket to whatever's next. And it wasn't, there was no kind of intrinsic thing of saying, well, I'm here, I'm in this great candy shop, I can get anything I want. And all I have to do is ask for it. But we have taught students, and especially maybe not the elite students, but many students, we've taught them that education doesn't have anything really much to do with their real lives or their thoughts or their needs or their futures even, other than that they might be able to qualify for a better job if they get a degree. And I just, so when you were talking about the idea of engaging students in different kinds of learning, that's what I was thinking, that by giving them the opportunities to experience real world problems, real world issues, what they can do then is to begin to integrate that into their own ideas about life, the universe, and everything. And to me, that's far more important, particularly in the liberal arts, than job training or whatever. But I think that what happens is that if you're engaging students in the real world, they get that anyway. So it's a much more integrated thing. It's like problem, if you focus students on a problem rather than on a discipline or whatever, they end up integrating their knowledge much better than they would if they're taking a set of discrete courses. For example, Evergreen State College in Washington State used to do these contract things where students could get together and say, we want to make a documentary about the whales in the Puget Sound. And they would get somebody from the film department and somebody from marine biology and somebody from English to help them write a script and so forth and so on. And they'd create this learning project for themselves. To me, that's, that kind of breaks down these artificial divisions between different disciplines and really allows students to concentrate on things that really matter to them. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, I think Jose wants to jump in. You're muted, Jose.
Stan, I want to jump in with a story that that I've already shared with you, and that is when I was starting to teach as a young PhD, I was teaching a graduate class in game theory, and halfway through the class, I had about 30 students. Halfway through the class, I take a break, and one of the students comes up to me, and he was a full colonel in the Army, and he said, Dr. Abar, you are indeed most eloquent. And I was very elated by that particular statement. And then he followed it up with the following statement: but I have not understood anything you have said over the past half of the semester. And of course, that took me aback. And I went home that evening. I kicked the cat. I said it had to be the student's fault. Obviously, he was not doing the readings, and took out a nice bottle of scotch and did some damage to that. All I got from that was a hangover and very little else other than that. In the morning, being a good academician, I got with the hangover, I went to the library and started looking at the materials in education and how to teach and all of that. And I could not find anything in the materials of the time. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, that were really germane to the problem that I was facing, until I got to Paulo Freire, which you may know from his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And one of the things that I got from the book was that in the process of his teaching, A, he became a facilitator, and B, he asked the students what is it that they wanted to learn. So I read it from cover to cover, and I realized that there were some gems of wisdom to be garnered from there. And I asked the students, what is it that they wanted to learn? Well, the military fellow came up and said, I want to know more about nuclear exchanges between countries, which is a plausible thing in game theory that we need to know. Another one said to me, Dr. Abar, I sell wines. How can I ascertain wine preferences? And I took that down and went down the list of the class and proceeded to get a good list of the things that they wanted to know. And then I took my syllabus and I reformatted it to their needs in terms of their preferences, in terms of the things that they have let me know. And we went on with the class. By the end of the semester, I had 30 A's on the papers that they wrote, and they were, extensive papers. We're talking with 30, 40 pages of materials that they handed in each one, which was substantial even for those times. And then I had the following experience. I get called in by the dean of education, by the dean of the unit, and he says to me, Dr. Abar, I cannot accept these grades. And I said to him, why? And he said, no graduate class here has ever had 30 A's. That doesn't work here at this university. And I said, just a moment, let me go back to my room and bring you the papers. So I brought him the papers, slammed it on his desk, and said the following: sir, the students earned this grade, and these are the papers that substantiate it. If you disagree with me, you can have my resignation. And that was the end of that conversation, and I was never bothered again. But the point of my story is not that. The point of the story is that I asked the students what they wanted to learn and became a facilitator of knowledge for them. In the process, changing the classroom dynamic completely into an engaging process for the student. It isn't a question of just problem-based learning or entrepreneurship, even though entrepreneurship has, there's an element of disdain related to entrepreneurship as we envision it in academia. It is a question of really, how do we move beyond the box that we're in and move towards a collaborative engagement process where the student feels that they're getting something out of the education that, quote unquote, whatever it is they're receiving in the classroom, that they can use for themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. We're running out of time, but anybody want to?
Yeah, I'd like to come out.
Sure.
I had a similar experience. In 1968, I gave 2 graduate classes, 65 A's. Everyone got an A, and the dean called me and said, "Why'd you do it?" And I said, "I'm in love," and I was fired. So I didn't have justification in academic, but I do think the idea of loving your students is something. It's what bound me for 53 years. I taught at a university of essentially first-generation students, immigrants of all various ethnicities. And the thing that resonated with them was that I could use humor in the classroom. In fact, I just published an article on humor, teaching history with humor. And that sort of, and I usually made myself the butt of the joke. And I think that humanized the classroom and created an atmosphere. But I want to come back to the point you made regarding your father, Stan. What you said in that anecdote is symptomatic of our culture. I think it was William Ogden developed this theory of the gap between technology and culture. And technology has advanced geometrically in our culture slowly. And that gap has to be narrowed. And until we have that gap, we're going to continue to engage and suffer from the failures of education.
Right. Well, Babita wants to say something. Babita, you have your hand up? Oh, you gave a thumbs up. I got you. Okay.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Dr. Joseph. It's really awesome. I do agree. It's really very good. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll close on that personal note. I often use my father as an example. He was an inspiration for my baseball research as well. I had 2 mentors, my father and Joe D there. The connection, it was a tension between me and my parents, because they both went to, they made it, well, my father went to Printers High School, went to vocational school. My mother went to a traditional school, Eastern Parkway, I think it was called. Anyway, in Brooklyn. Was it in Brooklyn? No, I'm not sure where it was actually.
Probably Prospect Heights.
Yeah, okay, there you go. But things connected us, and I would think of one specific thing, music. That was always, we could always communicate about that. And especially jazz. And so that was, something he passed on, and we in many ways communicated, even though we weren't necessarily talking about it, we were communicating about it. But it is that tension between tradition and change. And the anthropologist in me, again, keeps going back to Margaret Mead, which is that we have to understand that we have to understand change is inevitable also, but change is changing. And education, when I say it's not synchronized, I say it's just not, there's just a disconnection. Is that the right word? It's not connected. And all the comments were great. And I think we're probably going to continue this conversation to a certain extent next month, maybe when Jose gives his talk. And I would welcome anybody else who wants to give a talk as part of this series, colloquium series. Be in touch with me or be in touch with Sushma, and happy to do that. And the peanut gallery here.
Yeah.
My wife's here. She's raising her hand because she doesn't. What would you like to say?
I would just like to say that Stan and all of us here grew up in a time where college was all of a sudden made possible because we were dealing with normal schools. We're going to train teachers because we got these baby boomers. We're just going to have to train them to teach, train them to be. And I think that is sort of what we're dealing with right now, is a situation of education is still there. And we need to go beyond that. We need to realize many of the other things that we're saying. But
that's good. That's good.
That's it. I'm going to say it came out of the normal schools. Everybody could become a college professor. Everybody could become a teacher. And now our whole economy has changed. So we need to change how college is. That's what I'm going to say.
Right. And we can say that through our 3 children who ended up in the arts anyway, but
art's great.
Right. On that note, so I think there's a lot of things I've written down, and I wanted to point out, and I'm going to turn it over to Sushma to end the session. But ECCSSA puts out a chronicle or a newsletter. We call it a chronicle, and I'll be writing some of this up for that. And so I think we have all your emails. We'll stay in touch, and I want you to stay in touch. And again, I think we have one person who raised his hand about giving a talk. That would be Joe D, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to work on my forthcoming book, The Black Athlete as Hero,
Okay.
because it integrates politics, history, and sports, one of your passions.
Okay, well, I know that would be a great talk. And anybody else, it's open, and stay in touch. And and we'd love to have you all involved. I'm gonna thank all of you very, very much for spending these almost 2 hours with me and with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Sushma to close the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. And I also, I would like to thank our participants for joining us today, and hope to see you at our future events as well. And also, I would invite you to join us to our social media platforms and connect with us via our website. And also, if you are interested in an opportunity to serve and put your skills and talents to use, look at our call for board of members for the association. And we have this information in our website, or you can directly contact us. So we can provide you information. So you can also be part of this organization. Also, at the end, I would announce our next colloquium. It is scheduled on Friday, February 25th, and our speaker is Dr. Jose Aybar, and he will be talking towards academic renaissance and challenges. So please stay tuned for announcement, and we hope you will register when the announcement goes out and join us. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and stay safe. Well, we wish you the best. Take care, everyone.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushma, for nice word, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
everyone.
you. That was very interesting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.